For most of us, isolation is a choice we make once in a while. A weekend alone, a quiet evening to ourselves. But what happens when isolation becomes your entire existence? When you haven't experienced human connection, real, genuine physical touch, in so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to be held. This is the story of a woman who learned to survive alone. A woman who became so strong that people stopped seeing her as vulnerable. And a man so sheltered by his own life that he didn't understand the difference between independence and loneliness. What happens when these two worlds collide? When a moment of crisis forces them to see each other, not as stereotypes, but as human beings desperate for connection. This is a story about touch, about vulnerability, and about discovering that sometimes the strongest people are the ones willing to admit they need someone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Webb had spent 31 years learning how to be invisible. Not literally invisible, people could see him just fine. But invisible in the way that matters. Invisible in a crowd, unremarkable, safe. His mother had raised him that way, teaching him from childhood that the world was dangerous, unpredictable, and that the best way to survive was to stay separate from it. Don't trust easily. Don't let people get close. Don't take risks. Marcus had internalized these lessons so thoroughly that they'd become his blueprint for living. When his mother died 6 months ago, Marcus inherited her property. 200 acres of ranch land in northern Arizona, about 40 miles from the nearest town. The ranch had been in the family for 3 generations, but his mother had largely abandoned it after Marcus's father left when Marcus was 12. They'd moved to Phoenix, lived in a controlled suburban environment where his mother could manage every variable of his existence. Now, at 31 years old, Marcus was driving out to see what remained of that childhood property. He'd taken a leave from his job as a research librarian, a position that suited his temperament perfectly, surrounded by books and databases rather than unpredictable people. Marcus wasn't expecting much from the visit. He planned to spend a few days assessing the property, meeting with a realtor, and putting it on the market. The money from the sale would be comfortable. He could retire early, perhaps travel to quiet places, continue his research remotely. That was the plan. He didn't expect to find someone already living there. Her name was Sarah Whitmore, and she had no intention of leaving. Sarah had grown up in this valley. Her mother had been Navajo, her father white. She'd experienced the typical complications that came with being caught between cultures, welcome in neither with the same ease that full-blooded members of either group experienced. After college, she drifted for a while, worked various jobs, lived in different cities. But 15 years ago, when her relationship fell apart and she found herself truly alone, she'd made a decision. She was going to stop trying to fit into other people's worlds. She was going to build her own. The property next to Marcus's inherited ranch had been for sale for years. Nobody wanted it. Too remote, too much work required, insufficient water sources. Sarah had saved for a decade, working multiple jobs, living frugally, until she could afford to purchase it. She'd built her own small infrastructure there. A cabin, a barn, corrals for her horses. A modest but productive ranch operation based on raising quality horses and selling them to careful buyers. For the past 15 years, Sarah had lived almost entirely alone. Excuse me, are you the property manager here? Property manager? No, I'm the property owner. This is my ranch. I think there might be some confusion. I own this property. Or rather, I inherited it from my mother, Patricia Webb. I have the deed right here. What neither of them knew yet was that Marcus's mother had, in fact, sold the eastern portion of her property to someone about 10 years before her death. The transaction had been handled through a lawyer, and Marcus had never been informed. His mother had, in many ways, kept her affairs deliberately compartmentalized, telling her son only what she thought he needed to know. Sarah had discovered this when she'd researched the property boundaries carefully before purchasing her land. She'd recognized that the adjacent property was still technically in the Webb family name. But when the property taxes remained unpaid and no one had maintained it, she'd assumed it would eventually be foreclosed and sold at auction. She'd been prepared to bid on it herself. What she hadn't expected was for the owner to finally show up. Your mother and I had an understanding. She let me live here without harassment. I maintained the property, kept it from falling apart. She never bothered me, and I never bothered her. That's how it worked for the last decade and a half. I didn't know anyone was living here. My mother and I didn't speak very frequently. She didn't mention. Obviously she didn't. Look, I don't want to make this complicated. I have legitimate claim to the improvements I've made on this property. I've put significant resources and years of work into maintaining this place. If you're planning to sell, I'd like to make an offer before you list it with a real estate agent. Marcus spent that first evening at the main house, which was still furnished with his mother's sparse belongings. Sarah had kept her distance, returning to her own property across the property line that divided the two ranches. Marcus heated a frozen dinner in the microwave and sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the deed and the documents his mother had left behind. The truth was that Sarah's claim had merit. She'd invested heavily in maintaining the property. The corrals were in excellent condition. The fencing was well maintained. The land showed no signs of neglect. If anything, this property had been better cared for than many actively owned ranches. Marcus could evict her legally. The property was his, but something in him recoiled from the idea. His mother's passive manipulation of his life had taught him to recognize manipulation in others, but it had also made him uncertain about his own judgment. What if Sarah was taking advantage? What if she was being completely honest? He'd decided that the best approach was to spend a few days observing, to gather information, to understand what Sarah was really about before making any decisions. Sarah had seen him walking the property. She'd watched from a distance, recognizing the pattern of someone trying to gather information without directly asking questions. She understood the type. She'd encountered enough controlling people in her own life to recognize the wariness that comes from being raised by someone who believes the world is dangerous. But Sarah didn't have the luxury of patience. She had horses that needed feeding, maintenance projects that couldn't wait, and a life that had been disrupted by the unexpected arrival of this property's actual owner. She needed to know what he intended to do. You're going to break something if you keep turning that valve without understanding what you're doing. I was just checking. I know what you were doing. You don't understand the water system. It's more complicated than it looks. And if you damage the wellhead, we're both in trouble. I need this water. I'm sure you need it too, now that you're here. We should probably establish some boundaries. I'm planning to hire someone to assess the property properly. Someone who actually knows what they're doing. Of course you do. Let me save you some money. I'm right here. I've been maintaining this entire property for 15 years. I know every fence line, every water source, every structural weakness, and everything that works well. If you want a competent assessment, I can give you one. I'd prefer to hire an independent person who doesn't know this property and will charge you thousands of dollars to figure out what I already know. Or you can spend an afternoon with me. I'll show you everything. And you can make an informed decision about what to do with this place. It was during that afternoon that Marcus began to understand how deeply his mother had failed to prepare him for actual human connection. She'd spent 3 decades teaching him to be wary of people, to assume the worst, to keep everyone at a distance. And it had worked. He was certainly protected. He was also profoundly lonely, though he'd never quite admitted that to himself. She doesn't provide commentary. She doesn't try to convince him of anything. She simply shows him the work, lets it speak for itself. This property has potential. It's beautiful. It could be something really special if someone put the work in. But it also requires commitment. You can't half-ass a ranch. The land knows when you're not really invested. Everything falls apart faster than you'd expect Have you been happy here, living alone all this time? Happy is complicated. I've been safe. I've been productive. I've built something that's mine. Those are good things. But safety isn't the same as happiness. And I've started to wonder if I've been confusing the two. Neither of them knew it yet. But this moment, standing on the high point of a shared property, looking out at the same landscape, articulating something true about themselves, was the beginning of everything that would follow. Sarah had built her life in isolation, and Marcus had inherited his. They were about to discover that isolation, no matter how well constructed, was not actually a life at all, and they were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous thing we can do is let someone get close enough to touch us. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That first night, Marcus stayed in the main house. He'd made a decision, or rather, he'd deferred a decision. He would stay for a week, observe, and then determine what to do about Sarah and her claim to the property. He told himself it was a logical approach. He did not acknowledge that a significant part of him was afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of being taken advantage of, afraid of making a decision that would result in confrontation. His mother would have called it being prudent. Marcus would later understand it as cowardice dressed up in careful language. The house itself was sparse. His mother had removed most of her personal effects before moving to Phoenix. What remained were the practical items, furniture, kitchen equipment, basic necessities. No photographs, no mementos, no evidence of genuine life having been lived here. Marcus found one thing that surprised him: a leather journal on the kitchen table. His mother's handwriting on the first page. For Marcus, when he's ready to understand. But he wasn't ready. He put the journal in a drawer and closed it firmly. Marcus unpacked his belongings with careful precision. Books organized by subject, clothing folded in neat stacks, toiletries arranged in the bathroom in alphabetical order. Everything had its place. Everything was controlled. He'd showered, dressed in fresh, carefully coordinated clothes, and attempted to navigate the kitchen. He made coffee. He looked lost. At approximately 7 in the morning, someone knocked on the door. Sarah stood there, holding 2 thermoses and looking considerably more awake than Marcus felt. She'd already been working. There was evidence of it in the dust on her jeans, the slight sheen of sweat on her forehead despite the early hour. "I brought coffee. It's decent coffee. Not the kind of thing you make by staring at a coffee maker like it's a puzzle you need to solve. Also, we need to talk about the water situation. There's a problem developing in the northern section, and it's going to get worse if we don't address it today. I wasn't expecting—" "No, I know. You prefer to be left alone, to figure things out yourself. But here's the reality. This property doesn't operate on an individual timeline. The land has its own needs, and they don't accommodate people who need to process and contemplate. Either we work together to fix this today, or you can explain to me why I should let my ranch suffer because you need time to be comfortable." Marcus accepted the coffee and took a sip. The coffee was, as Sarah said, considerably better than what he was making himself. He wanted to argue, but something in him recognized that Sarah's point was valid. What kind of problem? "Come see for yourself." Sarah led Marcus across the property to the northern section. As they walked, the landscape changed. They moved from the flatter areas to terrain that was more complex, with arroyos and patterns that suggested water movement. Sarah pointed to areas where the earth showed signs of erosion, where the careful water management system his mother and Sarah had apparently developed was beginning to fail. This well system was designed to distribute water across both properties. "It's been working fine because I've maintained it obsessively, but there are components that are 20 years old. They're starting to fail. If this main line ruptures, we're both in trouble. The equipment to replace it is expensive, and more importantly, it's not something a single person can install alone. It requires 2 people minimum, and ideally someone who actually knows what they're doing." "How do you know all this?" "You're a horse breeder, not a hydrologist. When you live alone and something breaks, you have two choices. Learn to fix it yourself or pay someone else enormous amounts of money. I chose to learn. Your mother was smarter than she seemed. She kept detailed records of everything. After she stopped maintaining the property actively, I got her permission to study those records so I could understand the systems. I've also taken courses. I've read extensively. This is my life. I understand it. Marcus looked at the deteriorating infrastructure. His analytical mind processed the situation, the financial implications, the practical needs, the reality that this problem wouldn't solve itself. He was also beginning to understand that Sarah's presence here wasn't a convenience or an intrusion, but a necessity. What would it cost to replace? About $12,000 for materials. Another $5,000 in labor if you hire someone. That's assuming nothing else is damaged during the process. And it needs to happen within the next 2 weeks before monsoon season arrives. Once it starts raining heavily, you can't work on this kind of infrastructure. I don't have $12,000 readily available. I'm a librarian on a leave of absence. I have savings, but they're not immediately accessible. I have $17,000 in a savings account. I was planning to use it for my own property improvements, but this system affects both of us. I could cover the cost. You pay me back when you sell the property, or when you decide what you're doing with it. Marcus looked genuinely surprised. He hadn't expected Sarah to offer this. His suspicion mechanism started activating. Why would she do this? What advantage did she gain? But as he watched her face, he recognized something in her expression. This wasn't calculation. It was practicality mixed with something like kindness, though Sarah didn't seem like someone who used that word to describe her motivations. Why would you help me? You don't know me. I could sell this property tomorrow to someone who wants to develop it, and you'd be left with neighbors who have no respect for the land. Yes, you could do that. And I'd deal with it, because I'm good at dealing with difficult situations. But I'm going to bet that you're not that person. I'm going to bet that beneath all the careful control and the caution, you actually care about whether this land is treated well. Am I wrong? Marcus didn't answer immediately. He was looking out over the property, considering the question. Sarah stood beside him, patient, waiting for his response. It was an act of faith that Sarah offered, not in Marcus specifically, but in the possibility that he might be someone worth believing in. And Marcus, who'd been taught by his mother that faith in people's goodness was naive, found himself wanting to live up to that expectation. He didn't trust it, but he wanted to. They spent the day working together. Sarah teaching Marcus about the water system, explaining the mechanics, showing him what needed to be done. Marcus, once he moved past his initial resistance, proved to be a capable learner. His analytical mind grasped the theoretical aspects of the system quickly. His careful nature meant he was methodical and detail-oriented. They worked side by side. Marcus held something in place while Sarah measured. Sarah explained the function of a component, while Marcus took notes. There was a growing rhythm to their interaction, not quite comfortable, but less awkward than it had been. By late afternoon, they'd developed a preliminary plan for the repair. They'd identified the specific components that needed replacement. Sarah had suppliers in town who could provide the materials quickly. The work could be done in phases over the next 10 days, which would have them finished before the weather turned. They returned to the main property, both tired, both covered in dust. Sarah looked at Marcus with something like assessment, trying to determine if he was actually going to follow through with this, or if this was just a momentary lapse in his careful avoidance of commitment. You should get cleaned up. I'm going to head into town to order the materials. I'll pick up supplies for dinner too. We should eat together and finalize the work schedule. Otherwise, we're going to keep making decisions separately and then getting frustrated when they don't align. You want to have dinner together? I want to conduct this repair efficiently. That requires coordination. Dinner while we coordinate is the practical approach, unless you have an objection. No, I didn't expect you to suggest it. I'm not suggesting friendship or emotional connection. I'm suggesting that two people who live on adjacent properties that share infrastructure should occasionally eat a meal together and discuss practical matters. It's basic logistics, but even as Sarah said this, there was something beneath the words. A recognition that perhaps it was more than logistics, but also an acknowledgement that Marcus wasn't ready to acknowledge it. And Sarah wasn't going to push him towards something he'd just defensively retreat from. Marcus showered. He stood under the water for a long time, as though washing away something more than dust. He dressed in clean clothes, a habit of his, this constant cleanliness, this constant management of his appearance, for someone like Marcus, whose entire life had been structured around avoidance of entanglement. The invitation to share a meal with Sarah felt enormous. It wasn't the meal itself, it was what it represented. It was a step toward actual human connection. It was an acknowledgement that he couldn't manage this situation alone. It was a crack in the carefully constructed walls he'd spent his entire life building. Sarah returned from town with groceries. She'd brought ingredients for a simple dinner: chicken, vegetables, bread. She moved around the kitchen in the main house with a confidence that suggested she'd been there before, which she had. During the years of maintaining the property for Marcus's mother, she'd sometimes come to the house to discuss matters related to the land. Marcus emerged from upstairs. He hovered near the kitchen entrance, uncertain what his role should be. Sarah glanced at him. Either help or stay out of the way. You're making the space feel tense by hovering. I'm not sure what to do. Chop vegetables. Can you do that? I can learn. Sarah showed him how to hold the knife, how to cut the vegetables into uniform pieces. Her instructions were clear and practical. When Marcus made a mistake, cutting a piece too large, she showed him the correct size without criticism or comment. It was simply information being transferred. Touch, even this practical. Instructional touch, her hand guiding his hand on the knife. Her arm brushing his as they moved around the small kitchen was something Marcus hadn't experienced in years. His mother had been physically cold. She'd believed in maintaining distance, in reserving physical affection for moments that were awkward and obligatory. As an adult, Marcus had never had a romantic relationship of any real depth. He'd had one brief experience in college that had ended when he realized he couldn't manage the vulnerability it required. Sarah didn't seem to notice that she was doing something significant by simply teaching him how to cut a vegetable. To her, it was just information transfer. But to Marcus, it was profound. They ate dinner together at the kitchen table. The conversation was practical at first, discussing the water system, the repair timeline, the suppliers Sarah had contacted. But gradually as they ate, the conversation shifted. Sarah asked Marcus about his work as a librarian. Marcus asked Sarah about how she came to be a horse breeder. Sarah explained her journey, the relationship that had ended, the decision to start over, the years of building her operation. She described it matter-of-factly, without requesting sympathy, just conveying information about her life. I haven't done this in a long time. Had dinner with someone else, I mean. I've gone months without talking to another person, except for quick transactions in town. I thought I preferred it that way, but I'm starting to question whether I was actually preferring solitude, or if I was just afraid that connection would mean losing my independence. Was it? Did it mean that? Losing your independence? I don't know yet. That's the problem. I structured my life around the assumption that connection required sacrifice. I became self-sufficient specifically to avoid being in a position where I'd have to depend on someone. But I'm starting to wonder if I just traded one prison for another. Independence that's based on fear of vulnerability isn't actually independence. It's still a cage. Marcus listened to her. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his words were careful but genuine. My mother taught me that people would hurt me if I let them get close. So I didn't let anyone close. But I think she was wrong. Or maybe she was protecting me from her own fears more than from actual danger. I feel like I've been living inside a box that's supposed to keep me safe, but mostly it just keeps me alone. Sarah. So what do we do about that? Marcus, I don't know. I'm not good at this. At connections, at letting people matter to me. Neither am I, but we're both here. We both have to deal with this property, with each other. Maybe we start by just being honest about what's difficult, without pretending we're good at something we're not good at. They finished dinner in companionable silence. It wasn't a comfortable silence exactly. There was still an undercurrent of tension, of uncertainty, but it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of two people beginning to understand that they might be able to help each other, even though neither of them was quite ready to say that directly. Sarah stood to leave. At the doorway, Marcus did something impulsive. He reached out and briefly touched her arm, just a light contact, nothing dramatic. But it broke a barrier that had existed between them. Thank you for coming here, for dealing with me, for the dinner. Sarah looked at his hand on her arm. She didn't pull away. She didn't say anything in response. She simply nodded once, gently removed her arm, and walked out into the night. Marcus stood in the doorway, watching her return to her cabin across the property. He touched his own arm, as though he could still feel where they made contact. For someone who hadn't felt genuine touch in 6 months, or perhaps much longer than that, even this small moment of connection felt like it might change everything. Neither of them knew it yet. But this dinner, this moment, was the beginning of something that would challenge every assumption they'd made about themselves and about what it meant to be truly safe. They'd each built their lives around isolation, but they were about to discover that the greatest risk isn't in connection. The greatest risk is in believing that you can survive entirely alone. The first week of repairs progressed smoothly. They fell into a rhythm: early mornings at the northern well site, afternoons troubleshooting unexpected complications, evenings discussing the next day's plan. The work was demanding and concrete. There was no room for the awkwardness that had characterized their initial interactions. When you're holding a pipe while someone torches a connection, small talk becomes irrelevant. But on the 8th day, everything changed. A truck arrived at the main property. It was official looking, the kind of vehicle that belonged to government offices or corporate representatives. A man in his 50s emerged, wearing clothes that were too new, too clean for the desert. He carried a leather folder and moved with the calculated purposefulness of someone accustomed to getting his way. He was in the barn when the truck pulled up. He emerged to find her already standing on the porch of the main house, her body language immediately defensive. She saw him and gave him a look that communicated urgency without words. The man introduced himself as Richard Caldwell, representing Westridge Development Corporation. He requested to speak with the property owner about a time-sensitive business opportunity. He, still unpracticed in handling people who wanted something from him, invited Caldwell inside. She followed, crossing her arms as though bracing herself for impact. Caldwell laid out his proposal with the smoothness of someone who'd practiced it dozens of times. Westridge Development was planning a major resort and residential community in the northern Arizona region. The project would bring significant economic development to the area. Westridge had identified several key properties they needed to acquire to make the project feasible. His 200-acre property was perfectly positioned for the development's water and infrastructure systems. The offer was substantial, considerably more than what the land was worth as a functioning ranch. Caldwell presented it as though he was doing him a favor, giving him an opportunity to profit from land that, in his estimation, required too much work to be genuinely valuable. Her jaw tightened as he spoke. Caldwell continued, explaining that Westridge was prepared to move quickly. They needed to finalize land acquisitions within the next month. They were prepared to offer a signing bonus, a significant amount of money that would transfer immediately, with the full purchase price following within 6 months. All contingent on his commitment to sell and his agreement to not discuss the transaction with neighboring properties. That final condition made him pause. He asked Caldwell directly why it mattered whether he discussed the sale with neighbors. The development representative smiled, a practiced, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. Standard confidentiality protocol, he explained. Westridge didn't want to deal with multiple property owners trying to coordinate their sales or drive up prices through competition. She made a sound, half laugh, half frustrated exhale. She asked Caldwell directly if Westridge had also approached her property. Caldwell's response was carefully neutral. Of course, he said. Westridge had made preliminary inquiries about the neighboring ranch as well, but their initial focus was on acquiring his property, which was the more strategically important parcel. The implication was clear. Her land was secondary. Her value to the development was primarily based on her proximity to his property and whether her presence would complicate the project. Caldwell remained for another 30 minutes, presenting glossy brochures filled with artist renderings of the proposed resort, luxury homes, golf courses, hiking trails, a spa facility. It was designed to look appealing, to make the purchaser feel as though they were contributing to something transformative. He left the brochures and emphasized once more that the window for participation was closing rapidly. Westridge had other properties in their sights. If he wasn't interested, there were plenty of other landowners who would be. When Caldwell finally departed, there was a heavy silence in the house. She walked to the window and watched the truck disappear down the road. She turned to him, her expression a mixture of anger and resignation. She explained what had been happening. About 6 months ago, just after she had purchased her property, representatives from Westridge had approached her with an acquisition offer. Not as generous as the one he'd just received, but substantial enough to be tempting. She'd refused immediately. She'd spent 15 years building her ranch. She wasn't interested in cashing out for short-term profit, but the offers had kept coming. Different representatives, different approaches. First, it was direct offers. Then it was phone calls about upcoming water rights legislation that might affect her property value. Then it was subtle mentions of how difficult it would be to maintain a small ranch if the larger development process made the region unstable. She had initially dismissed it all, but as the frequency of contact increased, she began to suspect something larger was happening. She'd started researching Westridge development. What she discovered troubled her. The company had a pattern. They identified rural areas with potential for development. They targeted individual property owners, particularly those without strong community ties or family connections. They made offers that were attractive enough to tempt, but structured in ways that gave Westridge leverage. Once Westridge acquired enough contiguous land, they used that consolidation to pressure the remaining holdouts. Either sell at a lower price because the development was now inevitable, or refuse and watch your property become valueless as surrounding. Land was developed in ways that destroyed its agricultural viability. She had attended a county meeting about another Westridge project in a different region. The project had ultimately failed. The community had organized and refused to sell, but not before 3 years of legal battles and uncertainty had damaged the local economy and divided the community. He absorbed this information with growing concern. He asked her what she thought would happen if he accepted Caldwell's offer. Would Westridge actually develop the resort, or was this about something else? She explained that she'd researched that too. Westridge's track record suggested they often acquired land and then sat on it for years while they worked on permitting and infrastructure planning. In the meantime, the surrounding area deteriorated. Neighboring properties became less valuable. Communities became fragmented between those who'd sold and those who hadn't. Eventually, the remaining holdouts capitulated, selling at discounted rates because the area had become economically unstable. She believed Westridge's primary interest wasn't actually in developing a resort. It was in acquiring land at below-market rates by creating the appearance of inevitable change. Once they controlled enough property, they could either sell to larger corporations at a significant markup, or they could pivot to a different type of development entirely: mining, agriculture conglomeration, water rights consolidation. The resort proposal was the hook. The promise of economic development was designed to make land sales feel like participation in progress rather than capitulation to corporate pressure. He walked to the kitchen table and sat heavily. He'd inherited this property expecting it to be straightforward. Decide what to do, make a choice, move forward. Instead, he was discovering that the decision carried implications he hadn't anticipated. His choice wouldn't just affect his own future, it would affect her. It would affect the local community. It would contribute to patterns of corporate consolidation that undermined individual autonomy and community stability. He asked her why she was telling him all this. If she was genuinely concerned about Westridge's intentions, wouldn't it be easier for her to simply wish he would sell so that his property would be off the market and Westridge would move on to other targets? She was quiet for a long moment. She admitted that yes, it would be strategically advantageous for her if he sold. Westridge would eventually lose interest in the region if they couldn't acquire enough contiguous land. But she said she couldn't do that. She couldn't push him toward a decision that she believed was harmful even if it benefited her in the short term. The honesty in that statement struck him deeply. Here was someone who'd spent 15 years learning to prioritize her own interests and survival, and she was choosing not to. She was choosing to tell him difficult truths that might complicate his life because she believed he deserved to have complete information. That was a kind of trust that he had never experienced before. He asked her what she thought he should do. She said that wasn't her decision to make. She could tell him what she knew, but she wouldn't tell him what choice to make. This was his property, his inheritance, his future. He had to decide based on his own values, not based on her preferences or his fear of her judgment. But she added something important. Whatever he decided, there would be consequences. The consequences of accepting. Westridge's offer were different from the consequences of refusing, but neither path was consequence-free. He needed to be honest with himself about what he could live with. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the porch of the main house, looking out at the desert. He thought about his mother. She'd inherited this property and then abandoned it, moving to the city because the rural environment felt too uncertain, too uncontrollable. She taught him to fear the unknown, to assume the worst about people's intentions, to prioritize safety over engagement. But safety wasn't actually safe. It was just postponement. Eventually, decisions had to be made. Eventually, you had to engage with the world. The leather journal his mother had left, for Marcus, when he's ready to understand, was still in the drawer where he'd put it. He retrieved it and finally opened it. His mother's handwriting covered page after page. She wrote about her own childhood, about decisions her parents had made that had felt restricting at the time, but that she later understood were motivated by fear rather than wisdom. She wrote about selling the property, about why she'd never told him about it. She wrote about her regrets. The final entry, dated 3 weeks before her death, was brief. "I'm sorry I taught you to be afraid. I'm sorry I taught you that love required control. I hope someday you'll have the courage to be different. I hope you'll let someone matter to you." He read this entry several times. His hands shook slightly. It was simultaneously the closest his mother had ever come to a genuine conversation with him, and it was also too late for him to respond. He folded the journal closed and sat with it for a long time. When dawn arrived, he made a decision. He would not accept Westridge's offer, not because she had told him not to, but because his mother's final words had reminded him of something important. Some things were worth more than safety. Some things, connection, community, integrity, required courage, but this decision created a new problem. If he refused Westridge's offer, they would likely pressure him in other ways. They would approach her more aggressively. They might try to complicate his position in the community. They might make his life significantly more difficult, and she would be caught in the middle of a conflict that wasn't ultimately her responsibility. He needed to tell her what he'd decided. But more than that, he needed to understand what accepting this decision meant for both of them. His refusal of Westridge's offer was also implicitly a commitment to something. A commitment to fighting, to staying, to building something that mattered beyond just his personal safety. He went to find her at her ranch. She was in the barn, working on equipment maintenance. She looked up as he entered, seeming to read something in his expression immediately. He told her he was refusing Westridge's offer. He said it simply, without drama or explanation. Her expression shifted, surprise, then something that looked like relief, followed quickly by concern. She asked if he understood what that would mean. Westridge didn't accept refusals easily. They would intensify their efforts. They might use legal tactics, regulatory pressure, anything that could make life difficult for those who wouldn't cooperate. He acknowledged that he understood the risks, but he said something that surprised them both. He couldn't make this decision alone anymore. His refusal wasn't just about what was best for him. It was also a choice that would affect her and the community. He needed to know if she believed this was the right decision, not because he would let her determine his choice, but because he trusted her perspective. He needed her to tell him honestly if he was making a mistake. She set down the wrench she'd been holding. She walked to where he stood and, for the first time, she initiated touch. She placed her hand on his shoulder. It was a gesture of connection and confidence, and he felt it reverberate through him, like an earthquake. She said that refusing Westridge was the right decision, not because it was easy or safe, but because it was true. Some lines shouldn't be crossed, some places shouldn't be surrendered, and some people were worth fighting for. She didn't specify what people she meant. They both understood without clarification. The decision to refuse Westridge felt clean in theory, but reality moved faster than he'd anticipated. 3 days after his refusal, Caldwell returned with a different approach. This time, he brought legal documents. The tone was no longer persuasive. It was threatening. Westridge had filed a claim against his property, arguing that improper water management on his land was affecting downstream water rights. They presented a cease and desist order, demanding that all well operations stop, immediately pending a full investigation. The legal language was convoluted, but the message was clear: cooperate or face an expensive legal battle. He sat in his lawyer's office in town, listening as the attorney, a tired-looking man named Roberts, who practiced in a small office above the bank, explained the situation. The claim had no legal merit, Roberts said, but defending against it would cost between $30,000 and $50,000. That was before any actual trial. If it went that far, costs could double. Westridge was betting that he didn't have that kind of money. They were betting that the threat of legal action would accomplish what financial incentives couldn't. She found him that evening sitting on the edge of the porch, staring at nothing. She'd driven into town and followed him back to the property. She knew something was wrong before he said anything. He showed her the legal documents. He explained the situation flatly, without emotion. The anger was there. He could feel it underneath every word, but he was working hard to contain it. She read through the documents carefully, her expression growing darker. When she finished, she looked at him with an intensity that made it clear this was far from over. She said they needed to talk to the community. They needed to explain what Westridge was doing and why. If the town understood the pattern, if people realized they were all being targeted through the same tactics, they could organize a response. Communities had power when they coordinated. Individual property owners didn't. He was hesitant. He didn't know these people. He'd only been in the valley for 2 weeks. He had no standing to ask them to take risks on his behalf. She said they weren't doing this for him. They were doing it for themselves. If Westridge succeeded here, they'd come for other properties next. The pattern always repeated. Target the isolated, the vulnerable, the ones without community support. If they stopped Westridge here, they protected everyone. But she added something more personal. She said that she had spent 15 years isolating herself because she thought independence meant never asking for help. She thought it meant handling everything alone. But what she'd learned in the past 2 weeks was that real strength wasn't solitude. Real strength was being willing to connect with others, to ask for support, to let people matter. She asked if he was willing to do that. Not just for survival, but because connection was actually better than safety. He looked at her. He thought about his mother's journal. He thought about all the years he'd spent protecting himself from vulnerability. He thought about the way her hand had felt on his shoulder when she initiated touch for the first time. He said yes. They started planning that night. She knew people in the community, ranchers who'd worked with her over the years, suppliers she dealt with regularly, neighbors who understood the value of collective action. She reached out to them quietly, not making a big announcement, but having individual conversations. She explained what Westridge was doing, showed them the legal documents, helped them understand the stakes. The response was better than either of them expected. Within 2 days, they had commitments from 9 property owners who'd all been approached by Westridge at some point. Some had received offers. Some had received veiled threats. Some had simply noticed representatives surveying their land without permission. By the end of the week, they'd organized a community meeting. The town hall was packed, more than 100 people. She stood at the front with him beside her, and she laid out the evidence. She explained Westridge's pattern. She showed documentation of their tactics in other regions. She explained the legal claim that had been filed against his property and why she believed it was a strategic move rather than a legitimate environmental concern. The response was immediate and forceful. People were angry. They'd been approached individually, isolated, left to make decisions without understanding they were part of a larger, coordinated effort. Learning that they'd all been targeted the same way. Learning that someone had finally said no and was willing to fight. It activated something in the community. A local attorney named Susan Chen stood up and offered to handle his legal defense pro bono. She said she'd been watching Westridge's tactics in other regions for years and had been waiting for an opportunity to challenge them in court. She said this case was exactly what she'd been looking for. A group of ranchers pledged to support him financially if legal costs exceeded what he could manage. They were careful to frame it not as charity, but as investment in community protection. If they could stop Westridge here, they protected their own interests. A documentary filmmaker named David, who lived in the valley, asked if they would let him document the fight. He said he'd been documenting corporate land grabs for 15 years. He wanted to tell this story about a community deciding to stand together instead of surrendering individually. It was overwhelming. He'd never experienced anything like this. People showing up for him, believing in him, fighting beside him, not because they knew him, but because they understood what was at stake. She watched him process it all. At one point, she pulled him aside during a break in the meeting. She asked him how he was feeling. He said he felt terrified. He said he'd spent his entire life avoiding situations exactly like this, situations where he had to trust other people, where his decisions would affect others, where vulnerability was required. This was everything he'd been taught to fear, but underneath the fear, he said, there was something else, something like relief. Like a weight he'd been carrying for years was finally being shared. She placed her hand on his arm. She said that's what community meant. It meant not having to carry everything alone. It meant being willing to be seen, to ask for help, to let people matter to you. She said something more vulnerable than anything she'd said before. She said that being around him had changed how she understood isolation. She'd thought she was choosing freedom by staying alone. But she was realizing that real freedom was being willing to depend on someone, to let someone depend on you, to build something together that neither of you could build alone. She said she'd spent 6 months without feeling another person's touch. But it wasn't just physical touch she'd been missing. She'd been missing this sense of being part of something larger than herself, this sense of mattering to people and having people matter to her. She asked him if he felt it too. He said yes. He said it terrified him because he didn't know how to do this, how to trust people, how to accept help, how to build something interdependent instead of independent. But he wanted to learn. She moved closer. For the first time, they stood without the barrier of practical tasks between them. For the first time, the touch between them was purely about connection, not about teaching or demonstrating or moving work forward. She placed both her hands on his face. She said she needed to tell him something, and it required absolute honesty. She said that somewhere in the past 2 weeks, somewhere between the water systems and the legal documents and the community meetings, she'd fallen in love with him. She said it terrified her. She said she was acknowledging it now because this situation was going to get more difficult before it got better. And she needed him to know that whatever happened, whatever Westridge did, whatever legal battles lay ahead, she was choosing to be in this. She was choosing him. He stood very still. No one had ever said that to him before. No one had ever chosen him that explicitly, that vulnerably. He said he loved her too. He said it felt like learning a language he'd never known existed. But he was certain. He was more certain of this than he'd ever been of anything in his carefully controlled life. They kissed. It wasn't the tentative, hesitant kiss of people figuring out if connection was possible. It was the kiss of two people who'd decided to risk everything, their safety, their isolation, their comfortable separation, for something neither of them could get alone. When they returned to the community meeting, people noticed. They could see it in the way he stood beside her now, not just as an ally, but as a partner. They could see it in the way she looked at him, not with calculation, but with genuine love. The meeting continued, but the energy had shifted. This wasn't just about fighting a corporation. It was about a community choosing to show up for people who were choosing vulnerability with each other. It was about understanding that real strength was connection. Susan Chen outlined her legal strategy. She said the claim Westridge had filed was easily defensible. She said she would counter-file, exposing their pattern of predatory practices. She said there was a strong case for a class action lawsuit representing all the property owners who'd been targeted. She asked if everyone was willing to participate. She explained that it would require transparency, sharing documentation, potentially testifying. It would take time and emotional energy, but the outcome could set precedent that would protect other communities from Westridge's tactics. Every hand in the room went up. As people filed out after the meeting, they stopped to speak with him. They introduced themselves. They told him their stories, about offers they'd received, about pressure they'd felt, about how they'd been thinking of caving in until they understood the larger pattern. They thanked him for being willing to fight. She watched him interact with these people. She could see him learning something fundamental, that connection required vulnerability, that asking for help didn't make you weak, that being part of a community meant you never had to carry everything alone. Late that night, they sat in his house, the house that had belonged to his mother, that he'd inherited, that he'd almost surrendered to corporate interests. They sat together on the porch, watching the stars. He said he'd made a choice 2 weeks ago to refuse an offer that would have solved all his problems financially. That choice had felt impossible, but it had led to this, to her, to community, to discovering that what he'd actually been afraid of wasn't failure, but connection. He said he understood now why his mother had abandoned this place. She'd been afraid. And fear was contagious. It passed from generation to generation until someone was brave enough to break the pattern. She said she understood that. She said she'd broken a different pattern, the pattern of thinking she had to do everything alone. She said being with him was teaching her that strength and vulnerability weren't opposites. They were the same thing. She asked him if he was ready for what came next. She said Westridge would probably escalate. They might bring more legal pressure. They might try different tactics. This wasn't going to be resolved quickly or easily. He said he wasn't ready. He said he was still terrified. But he said that having her, having the community, having people who'd chosen to stand beside him, that made it manageable. That made the fear something he could move through, instead of something that paralyzed him. She took his hand. She said that was all anyone could do. Move through the fear with people who cared about them. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. The legal battle would intensify. Westridge would probably try new tactics. The community would be tested. But tonight, for this moment, there were just the two of them and the stars, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest risk wasn't in connection. The greatest risk was in believing you could survive it alone. The morning after the community meeting, reality hit harder than either of them expected. The lawsuit Westridge filed wasn't just a strategic move, it was comprehensive. They documented alleged violations spanning 18 months, claiming that the water system modifications had violated state environmental codes. They'd included satellite imagery, supposedly showing erosion patterns consistent with improper water management. They'd attached affidavits from expert witnesses that, despite being technically flawed, sounded authoritative to anyone unfamiliar with hydraulic engineering. Susan Chen called an emergency meeting at her law office. She spread the documents across her conference table and walked them through the strategy. What Westridge had done was sophisticated corporate litigation, overwhelming in volume, impressive in appearance, but vulnerable to systematic challenge. The problem was that defending against it required resources most individuals didn't have. She explained that their counter-strategy would be multifaceted. They would challenge the scientific claims point by point. They would request discovery of all communications between Westridge and their expert witnesses, which would likely reveal that the witnesses had been paid to produce predetermined conclusions. They would file motions to throw out the case entirely, arguing that Westridge lacked standing to sue because they had no direct financial interest in the disputed water rights. But it would take time. And during that time, the narrative would be set by whoever controlled the story. Westridge was already reaching out to local media, positioning themselves as concerned environmental advocates. They were framing him as a reckless property owner who'd recklessly modified a sensitive ecosystem. David, the documentary filmmaker, said he wanted to get ahead of that narrative. He wanted to produce a short documentary, maybe 30 minutes, that told the real story. He wanted to interview him, her, community members, and environmental experts who could speak to the actual science. He was hesitant. He said the idea of being filmed, of his story being public, felt like exposure he hadn't signed up for. But she squeezed his hand under the table and said something quietly. Exposure was the antidote to secrecy. Secrecy was how corporations like Westridge maintained power. They counted on individuals being too ashamed or too afraid to tell their stories publicly. He agreed to participate in the documentary. What followed were weeks of intensive work. He and she worked with David to reconstruct the timeline of events. She provided all her research on Westridge's tactics. They gathered testimonies from community members who'd been approached by the corporation. They located environmental experts, professors from Arizona State University and the University of Arizona, who agreed to review the water management system and provide professional assessments. During this time, their relationship deepened in ways that went beyond romantic connection. They learned how to work together under pressure. When frustration threatened to overwhelm him, she kept perspective. When she became discouraged by the complexity of the legal documents, he broke them down into manageable pieces. They developed a rhythm, not just of collaboration, but of genuine partnership. They also had their first real conflict. It happened late one night while they were organizing documents at his property. She'd made a decision about the documentary's direction without consulting him. She'd told David that she wanted to emphasize the gender dynamics of corporate predation, how Westridge had targeted her specifically as a woman rancher, using different pressure tactics than they used on him. She'd framed it as a larger feminist critique of resource extraction. He felt blindsided. He said she was making their situation about her narrative when it was supposed to be about the community's fight against Westridge. He said she was appropriating the collective struggle for personal political positioning. She didn't apologize. She said that his perspective, that personal experiences should be separated from political context, was exactly the kind of thinking that allowed systemic problems to persist. She said that her experience as a woman being treated as secondary to his property, as less valuable to the corporation, was inseparable from the larger corporate strategy. She said refusing to name that wasn't noble. It was complicit. They didn't speak for 2 days. It was the first real separation since they'd begun their relationship. He realized during those 2 days how much he'd come to depend on her presence. Not just romantically, but intellectually and emotionally. She'd become his primary reference point for understanding the world. She called him on the morning of the 3rd day. She said they needed to talk face to face. She came to his property with coffee, a ritual that had become their way of beginning difficult conversations. She said she understood why he'd felt blindsided. She said she should have discussed the documentary angle with him first, but she also said she couldn't minimize her own experience to make him more comfortable. She said that was the trap she'd been in for 15 years, making herself smaller, less visible, less demanding to avoid conflict. She said love wasn't about becoming compatible by erasing the parts of yourself that might create friction. Love was about being able to hold both truths simultaneously, that they were partners in this fight, and that they were also individuals with different experiences and perspectives. She asked if he could do that. Could he accept that they might disagree sometimes? Could he accept that her feminist analysis of corporate predation wasn't a betrayal of their shared struggle, but an integral part of it? He said yes. He said it was terrifying because disagreement meant they weren't in perfect harmony. But he was realizing that perfect harmony was another form of the isolation he'd been running from. Real connection meant holding complexity together. They kissed, but it wasn't reconciliation in the traditional sense. It was acknowledgement that they could survive conflict and come out stronger. The documentary began to take shape. David conducted hours of interviews. He filmed her explaining her water system to a university hydrologist who verified that the system was not only non-damaging to the environment, but actually improved water quality compared to standard methods. He filmed community members describing their experiences with Westridge. He filmed her and him working together on the property, their collaboration evident in every movement. But David also captured something else. He captured the quiet moments. Her placing her hand on his shoulder while they looked over legal documents. Him bringing her coffee without being asked. Understanding her rhythms well enough to know when she needed the support. The two of them standing together watching the sunset, holding hands without performing for the camera. David said that was the real story. It wasn't just about corporate predation or environmental protection or community organizing. It was about two broken people learning to build something together. It was about isolation being broken by connection. Meanwhile, the legal case moved forward. Susan filed her countermotions. She requested discovery of all communications between Westridge and their expert witnesses. What emerged was exactly what she'd predicted. Email chains showing that Westridge had hired consultants with predetermined conclusions. Paid them to produce studies that validated those conclusions regardless of actual evidence, and then presented those studies as independent expert analysis. It was damning. It was also exactly the kind of behavior that was common enough in corporate litigation, that Westridge wasn't particularly worried about consequences. But something unexpected happened. A junior attorney at Westridge's law firm, someone fresh out of law school named Thomas, came forward. He'd been troubled by the ethical violations he was witnessing. He provided copies of internal emails where senior partners explicitly discussed the strategy of burying legitimate challenges with volume and expense. Thomas's whistleblowing gave Susan legal ammunition she hadn't had before. It transformed the case from a defensive action to a potential offensive against Westridge itself. During this time, he and she had less time together, but more profound connection. They text constantly, quick updates, thoughts, moments of vulnerability. She sends him a message at 2 in the morning, saying she can't sleep, because she's anxious about the deposition. He calls her immediately and talks to her until she falls asleep listening to his voice. He realizes one evening that physical touch has become something he initiates now. He puts his hand on her back when they're walking. He pulls her close when they're sitting. He initiates kisses without hesitation. The person who hadn't felt genuine touch in 6 months, or perhaps much longer than that, is now someone who seeks connection constantly. She notices this transformation. One afternoon, while they're waiting to meet with Susan, she asks him about it. She says she's watched him change. She says the man who arrived at this property 3 weeks ago, stiff and controlled and terrified of human connection, has slowly become someone who reaches for her without fear. He says it's her. He says that somehow, by being willing to be vulnerable first, she'd created a space where his own vulnerability didn't feel dangerous. He says she'd taught him that touch wasn't something to be rationed or feared. It was how humans communicated care. She says that's not entirely true. She says he'd also changed her. She says that by being willing to trust her, even when it was difficult, even when she made decisions he disagreed with, he'd given her permission to be less defended. She says she's crying more now. She's laughing more. She's taking more risks. She's living more fully than she had in 15 years. The deposition date is set. Westridge will be required to answer questions under oath. It's the moment where the strategy either pays off or falls apart. The night before the deposition, they don't do anything particularly special. They cook dinner together at his house. They make mistakes. The pasta is overcooked, the sauce is too salty, and they laugh about it anyway. They eat standing up at the kitchen counter. They wash dishes together, their movements coordinated from weeks of working in proximity. After dinner, they sit on the porch and watch the desert transition from day to night. The sky shifts from blue to pink to orange to purple. Stars begin appearing. A coyote calls in the distance. She says she's terrified. She says that no matter what happens in the legal battle, their lives have changed. That's what terrifies her. She doesn't want to go back to isolation. She doesn't want to live without this, without him, without community, without the feeling of mattering to people and having them matter to her. He says that's not going to happen. He says that whatever Westridge does, whatever the courts decide, that won't change what they've built. They've built something real. They've built something that can handle pressure. She moves to sit in his lap, something she does now without hesitation. She wraps her arms around him and rests her head on his shoulder. She says she loves him, not for what he can do for her or what he can provide, but for who he's becoming, for his willingness to be vulnerable, for his commitment to fighting not just for himself, but for everyone. He holds her. He says he loves her too. He says she's changed everything. He says that 6 months ago his mother died, and he inherited a property and a set of abandonment issues that had structured his entire life. But in the past month, he's learned what it means to actually live instead of just managing risk. They sit together as night fully arrives. Tomorrow will bring legal battles and corporate pressure and all the practical complications of fighting for something real. But tonight, they're just two people who've learned that connection, genuine, vulnerable, risky connection, is worth everything they've sacrificed to find it. The deposition was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. The law offices of Westridge's attorney were in Phoenix, about 2 hours south. He and she drove together, with Susan following in her own car. The drive was mostly silent. Neither of them wanted to talk about what might happen. They'd done all the preparation they could do. The deposition room was sterile and professional. Westridge's senior counsel, a woman named Margaret Hartley, who'd been litigating environmental cases for 30 years, sat across from him at a long table. A court reporter documented everything. Susan sat beside him. What happened over the next 6 hours was a masterclass in intimidation dressed up as procedure. Hartley asked him questions that seemed innocent, but were designed to trap him in contradictions. She asked about the water system modifications with such technical specificity that he couldn't answer without being corrected, creating the impression of incompetence. She asked about his conversations with her in ways that suggested inappropriate coordination. She implied that he'd hired her specifically to strengthen his legal position, that their partnership was a calculated strategy rather than a genuine relationship. By the time the deposition ended, he felt hollowed out. Everything he'd learned about connection and vulnerability over the past month felt fragile under sustained attack. But when they walked out of the building, Susan was smiling. She said Hartley had made mistakes. Serious ones. She'd asked questions that opened doors for discovery that Susan hadn't anticipated. She'd gotten aggressive in ways that suggested Westridge was panicking. It was a good deposition, Susan said. Not because he'd performed perfectly, but because the corporation's lawyer had revealed more about their strategy than she'd expected. On the drive back to the valley, he found himself angry in a way he hadn't expected. He wasn't angry at Westridge or Hartley. He was angry at himself. He realized during that deposition that he was still performing. He was still performing the role of compliant, careful, controlled. Even in defending himself, he was playing a character. The part of him that his mother had trained him to be, invisible, manageable, small. She asked him what he was thinking about. He told her. He said that Hartley's strategy had worked on him precisely because some part of him believed the things she was implying. Some part of him still believed that his relationship with her was strategic rather than genuine. Some part of him was still waiting for connection to be revealed as a trap. She reached over and placed her hand on his knee. She said she understood. She said that trauma, real or imagined, didn't just disappear because you recognized it. She said she'd spent 15 years protecting herself through isolation, and she was still struggling with the impulse to retreat when things got difficult. But she said there was something important. They were doing it differently now. They weren't doing it alone. Whatever they were struggling with, his fear, her defensiveness, they were struggling with it together. That night, David called. He said he'd finished the first cut of the documentary. It was more powerful than he'd anticipated. He said he wanted them to watch it before he showed it to anyone else. They drove to David's house in town. He'd set up his editing suite in a converted garage. The documentary was 38 minutes long. It opened with David asking her direct questions about why she'd chosen to stand her ground. She answered with the kind of honesty that felt dangerous, talking about years of isolation, about how she'd built a fortress thinking it was a home, about how connection had terrified her more than any corporate threat. Then it moved to him. David asked him about his mother, about being taught to fear connection, about arriving at the property expecting it to be temporary. He spoke about how meeting her had changed everything. He spoke about learning to trust. He spoke about discovering that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was actually the only real strength he'd ever had. The documentary showed interviews with community members, the ranchers, the suppliers, people who'd been approached by Westridge. It showed testimony from environmental experts confirming that the water system was properly managed and actually beneficial. It showed satellite imagery and technical analyses that completely undermined Westridge's claims. But what made the documentary powerful wasn't the facts. It was the relationships. It was her and him working together, their collaboration visible in every frame, their partnership evident in the way they moved through the world. It was the community gathering, people standing together because they'd chosen connection over individual protection. And then David showed something unexpected. He'd included clips of Westridge's corporate materials, their glossy brochures, their marketing videos, their representations of the proposed development. He juxtaposed them with actual footage from communities where Westridge had operated. He showed abandoned developments. He showed properties that had become economically worthless. He showed the gap between promise and reality. When it ended, there was silence. She was crying, not from sadness, but from seeing the truth of their experience reflected back to them, from understanding that what had felt like a personal fight was actually part of a much larger pattern. He was quiet. He was processing something he couldn't quite articulate. Finally, He said that watching David tell their story had made him realize something. His fear of being seen, his impulse to hide, was exactly what made him vulnerable to predators like Westridge. Corporations counted on isolation. They counted on people being too ashamed or too afraid to tell their stories publicly. David said he was planning to submit the documentary to film festivals. He said he was also planning to share it with local media. He said the deposition results, combined with this documentary, gave them leverage they hadn't had before, but he warned them Westridge would escalate. When confronted with the possibility of public exposure, corporations often became more aggressive rather than less. They might bring new legal suits. They might try to discredit them personally. They might attempt to intimidate witnesses or community supporters. He asked if they were prepared for that. He asked if they understood what they were committing to. She grabbed his hand. She said they were prepared, not because they had all the answers or because they weren't afraid, but because they'd built something together that was worth defending, because they were no longer isolated, because connection itself was a form of power that Westridge couldn't touch. 2 days later, everything changed. A woman approached him at the feed store in town. She introduced herself as Rachel Martinez. She said she'd worked for Westridge Development 3 years ago as a land acquisition coordinator. She said she wanted to talk to him about something off the record. They met for coffee at a small cafe. Rachel explained that she'd left Westridge because of the ethical violations she was witnessing. But before she left, she documented everything. She had emails, memos, recordings of conversations where executives explicitly discussed using intimidation tactics to drive down property prices. She said she wanted to give him everything she had. She said she wanted the documentary to expose what Westridge really was, but there was a catch. She said Westridge had sued her for breach of non-disclosure agreement. They'd tied up her assets. She was struggling financially. She couldn't provide the documents openly. Westridge would claim they were stolen proprietary information and use that to invalidate them in court. She said she could give them everything, but it would have to be anonymous, and it would put her at serious legal and financial risk if they discovered she was the source. He told her he needed to talk to Susan before making any promises. He told her he understood the risks she was taking, but something about the offer felt wrong. It felt too convenient. It felt like exactly what they needed, at exactly the moment they needed it. He brought it to Susan immediately. Susan's response was cautious. She said Rachel's documents could be valuable, but she said she needed to verify Rachel's identity and history. She said she needed to understand exactly what documents Rachel was offering and whether they'd been obtained legally. Susan did her research. 2 days later, she called an emergency meeting. She explained that Rachel Martinez did exist. She had worked at Westridge. She did have a non-disclosure lawsuit pending against her, but there was something else. Rachel had been contacted by Westridge's legal team 2 weeks ago. They'd offered to settle her lawsuit if she would gather specific documents and pass them to whoever was fighting Westridge. They were setting a trap. They wanted Rachel to provide him with documents that could be characterized as improperly obtained. Then they would expose the relationship, discredit the documents, and argue that his entire case was based on stolen corporate materials. It was a sophisticated play. It was designed to make him complicit in corporate espionage, or at minimum, to make it look that way to a jury. Susan said she'd informed Rachel's lawyer, and Rachel was now cooperating with them instead. Rachel would testify about Westridge's attempt to manipulate her, but it meant that Westridge knew they were being exposed. They were desperate. Desperate corporations made dangerous moves. The revelation hit him harder than he expected. He'd been naive. He'd wanted to believe that there were allies out there, that people would help, that connection with others was straightforward. But the world was more complicated. People could be manipulated. Good intentions could be weaponized. Trust could be a vulnerability. She found him sitting alone at the property that evening. He was staring at nothing. She sat beside him without speaking. Finally, he said that he'd made a mistake, trusting Rachel. He said that his trust had almost destroyed everything. He said that maybe his mother had been right all along. Maybe isolation was safer. Maybe connection just gave people more ways to hurt you. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that would stay with him. Connection does give people ways to hurt you. That's true. But isolation doesn't protect you. It just makes the hurt happen in slow motion, day after day, year after year. At least with connection, you can survive the pain together instead of suffering it alone. She said that Rachel's attempt to trap them didn't invalidate connection as a principle. It just meant that connection required discernment. It required wisdom about who to trust. It didn't mean you stopped trusting. It meant you got smarter about it. She asked him if he was going to retreat, if he was going to let fear win, if he was going to abandon what they'd built because someone tried to weaponize trust against him. He said no. He said that giving up would mean surrendering everything they'd learned about themselves and each other. But he said it would be harder now. He said trust would require more conscious choice rather than naive hope. She kissed him. She said that was what real partnership was. Not perfect trust or unwavering belief, but conscious choice to stay connected even when it was difficult. Even when people tried to use connection against them. That night, she stayed with him. They didn't make love. They just held each other. Physical touch as an anchor, as a reminder that they existed together in the world. That their connection was real, despite corporate manipulation and legal schemes. Tomorrow would bring new strategies from Westridge. Tomorrow would bring more pressure, more complexity, more chances for people to be hurt or betrayed. But tonight, they chose connection. They chose each other. They chose to believe that vulnerability was worth the risk. The trial date arrived on a Monday morning in late September. The courtroom was packed. Community members filled the gallery. Media representatives occupied the front rows. David was there with his camera, documenting everything. The documentary had been released online 2 weeks prior and had already been viewed by over 200,000 people. Westridge's predatory practices had become public knowledge. Judge Helen Morrison presided. She was a woman in her 60s with a reputation for careful analysis and zero tolerance for corporate manipulation. She'd reviewed the pre-trial motions and had already granted Susan's request to exclude most of Westridge's expert testimony. She'd ruled that Rachel Martinez's attempted entrapment was admissible evidence of consciousness of guilt. Westridge's lead attorney, Margaret Hartley, looked visibly tense as the proceedings began. The corporation had expected this to be a straightforward case. They'd expected to overwhelm a rural property owner with legal complexity. Instead, they were facing a coordinated community, experienced legal representation, documentary evidence, and public scrutiny. Susan opened her case methodically. She presented the water system as it actually functioned. She brought in the environmental scientists who testified that the system was not only compliant with all regulations, but actually superior to standard methods. She presented the satellite imagery and technical analyses that completely contradicted Westridge's claims. Then she brought in the documents. Rachel's preserved emails showed Westridge executives explicitly discussing the strategy. They showed emails where consultants were hired with the instruction to find problems that justify the legal action. They showed internal discussions about using legal intimidation to drive down property values. Thomas, the junior attorney who'd whistleblown, testified. Under Susan's questioning, he detailed the ethical violations he'd witnessed. He described being told to file claims he knew were meritless. He described pressure to obscure the basis for expert opinions. He described a legal strategy designed to weaponize litigation itself. When Hartley cross-examined him, she attempted to discredit him as a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. But Thomas remained calm and credible. He said he'd left the firm specifically because he couldn't continue being complicit in unethical practices. On the second day, Susan called community witnesses. The ranchers testified about their experiences with Westridge. They testified about feeling isolated and manipulated. They testified about how understanding the coordinated strategy had shifted their perspective entirely. They testified that they now understood they weren't dealing with a legitimate business, but with predatory corporate tactics. The mayor testified about the impact on the community. She described how Westridge's activities had divided people, created uncertainty, and degraded social cohesion. She testified about the economic damage of letting corporations pit individual property owners against each other. When it was Westridge's turn to present their case, Hartley attempted to recover. She called her environmental experts, but their testimony crumbled almost immediately under Susan's cross-examination. She presented them with their correspondence with Westridge, showing they'd been instructed to reach predetermined conclusions. She asked pointed questions about their methodology. She highlighted the gaps between what the science actually showed and what they were claiming. By the end of the second day, it was clear that Westridge's case was essentially destroyed. Judge Morrison's questions from the bench suggested she'd already reached her conclusion. This was a case of corporate malfeasance, not environmental protection. On the third day, Susan called him to testify. He sat in the witness box, aware that his testimony might not be technically necessary. The evidence was already overwhelming, but that it was symbolically important. Susan asked him to describe his property and what it meant to him. He spoke about inheriting it from his mother. He spoke about initially planning to sell it. He spoke about meeting her and discovering that some things were worth more than financial gain or personal safety. He spoke about learning to trust. He spoke about overcoming his fear of connection. He spoke about understanding that community was stronger than individual protection. Susan asked him about the decision to refuse Westridge's initial offer. He said it wasn't primarily a financial decision. It was a moral decision. It was about recognizing that some places shouldn't be sold to corporations. Some communities shouldn't be destroyed for profit. And some people, himself included, were worth more than their market value. Hartley's cross-examination was perfunctory. She attempted to paint him as motivated by romantic interest in her, as if that invalidated his principles. But the strategy backfired. Judge Morrison visibly bristled at the implication that a man and woman couldn't have legitimate shared values. The gallery murmured. The media wrote it down. Then she was called to testify. She spoke about 15 years of isolation. She spoke about building a ranch and believing she could do everything alone. She spoke about the moment she'd realized that independence achieved through fear wasn't actually freedom. It was another kind of cage. She spoke about his arrival at the property. She spoke about initial resistance giving way to partnership. She spoke about learning that vulnerability wasn't weakness and that connection was actually the most powerful thing she'd ever experienced. When Hartley cross-examined her, she attempted the same strategy, painting her as emotionally compromised, suggesting her decisions were motivated by romantic attachment rather than principle. But she responded with the kind of clarity that made it obvious this was exactly the wrong approach. She said that yes, she loved him. She said that didn't invalidate her analysis of Westridge's tactics. She said that love wasn't blind. It actually allowed her to see more clearly because she cared about the outcome. She said that Hartley's suggestion that love was somehow incompatible with sound judgment was exactly the kind of thinking that made corporate predation possible. It was the idea that only isolated, unconnected people could think clearly, that caring about other people compromised your reasoning. She said that was backwards. Love improved reasoning. Connection improved judgment. Communities made better decisions than isolated individuals. The evidence in the courtroom proved it. The gallery erupted in quiet applause. Judge Morrison didn't reprimand it. On the fourth day, attorneys delivered closing arguments. Hartley attempted one final play. She argued that even if Westridge had used aggressive tactics, the underlying environmental claims still had merit. She said her experts should be believed over community members and university scientists. Judge Morrison interrupted her. She said that the court had already heard from qualified environmental scientists whose expertise was unquestionable. She said that Westridge's experts had been shown to be predetermined instruments of corporate strategy rather than independent analysts. She said that the law required honest evidence, not weaponized litigation. Susan's closing argument was brief. She said the evidence was clear. Westridge had filed a meritless lawsuit with the intent of intimidating a property owner into selling his land. When that failed, they'd attempted to manipulate a third party into providing evidence that could be used against him. They'd employed expert witnesses willing to manufacture analysis for corporate profit. She said the question before the court was whether corporations could use litigation as a weapon against individual property owners. She said the answer had to be no. Judge Morrison deliberated for 45 minutes. When she returned, she delivered a judgment that was comprehensive and scathing. She ruled that Westridge's case was dismissed entirely. She found that they'd filed the suit in bad faith, not based on legitimate environmental concerns, but as an instrument of corporate coercion. She ordered Westridge to pay his legal fees, approximately $120,000, far exceeding what Westridge's initial offer had been. She imposed sanctions on Westridge's attorneys for ethical violations. She stated for the record that she was referring the case to the State Bar Association for investigation of Hartley and her team's conduct. And then Judge Morrison did something unusual. She issued a judgment that wasn't technically part of the case, but was clearly directed at what had happened. She stated that corporations using litigation to intimidate individuals and communities into abandoning property rights were engaged in unlawful restraint of commerce. She wrote that communities had both the legal right and moral obligation to organize. Against such tactics, the judgment essentially gave legal validation to everything the community had been doing. When the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted. Not in loud celebration, but in the kind of quiet, profound relief that comes from vindication. He and she sat beside each other, hands intertwined. She had tears running down her face. He was very still, processing what had just happened. Outside the courtroom, media crowded around them. David documented every moment. Reporters asked about their plans, asked about their relationship, asked about what they would do with their property now. He said he wasn't selling. He said he was staying. He said he was going to build something on that land that mattered, something that went beyond financial extraction or personal profit. He said he was going to create a model for how rural communities could be sustainable economically, while also being sustainable socially and environmentally. She said she wanted to partner with him in that effort. She said the past months had taught her that isolation wasn't survival. It was just slow death. She said she wanted to build something together that could serve as an example for other communities facing similar corporate pressure. They held a community celebration that evening at the town hall. Over 200 people attended. The community members who'd stood together against Westridge gathered to acknowledge what they'd accomplished. Susan was there, already receiving calls from other communities facing similar situations. The litigation victory was becoming a template. Other property owners were reaching out, asking how they could organize, how they could fight back. Rachel Martinez was there. Her lawsuit with Westridge had been settled. She'd been vindicated. She approached him and her privately and apologized profusely for the attempted entrapment, though it was clear she'd been manipulated. They forgave her immediately. Thomas, the whistleblowing junior attorney, was there. He'd already received job offers from 3 different firms that wanted to hire someone willing to stand up against corporate misconduct. David announced that his documentary had been accepted into the Sundance Film Festival. It would receive significant distribution. The story of community organizing against corporate predation was becoming something that could influence policy and inspire others. Late that night, after the celebration had wound down, he and she drove out to their property. They stood at the high point overlooking both ranches, looking out at the landscape that had become so central to their story. She said she'd received several phone calls from developers wanting to purchase her land at premium prices. Now that the legal battle was resolved, She said she'd turned them all down. She said the land wasn't for sale, not to developers, not to corporations. It belonged to her, and she belonged to the community. He said the same about his property. He said his mother had abandoned this place because she was afraid. He said he'd almost done the same. But he'd learned something crucial. Places matter. Communities matter. Connection matters. He said he'd been thinking about his mother's journal. The final entry had asked him if he'd have the courage to be different, to let someone matter to him. He said he'd found that courage. He said she'd given him that courage. She moved close to him. She placed her hands on his face, the same gesture she'd used when she first told him she loved him. She said that the past 6 months without touch, the past 15 years of isolation, had all led to this moment. She said that sometimes you had to lose yourself completely to finally find yourself in connection with someone else. She said that his arrival at the property had felt like disruption, but it had actually been salvation. It had saved her from a slow death of isolation. It had saved him from a life of controlled fear. He kissed her. It wasn't desperate or urgent. It was the kind of kiss that came from deep certainty, from knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. Behind them, the property stretched out in the moonlight, the well they'd repaired together, the corrals where horses grazed, the land that had become the foundation of their relationship. Ahead of them lay a future they would build not alone, but together, not in isolation, but in community. The legal battle was won, but the real victory was something far more personal. 2 people had chosen to stop running from connection and instead run toward it. And in that choice, they discovered that vulnerability was actually the strongest thing they possessed. 3 months after the trial verdict, the documentary premiered at Sundance Film Festival to a standing ovation. Reviewers called it a powerful examination of corporate predation and community resistance. More importantly, it sparked conversations. Environmental organizations reached out. Community development groups wanted to understand the model. Other rural communities facing similar corporate pressure contacted David for advice, but the real changes were happening closer to home. Thomas left Westridge's law firm and established his own practice focused on defending individuals and communities against corporate land grabs. He opened his office in the valley, working pro bono for cases he believed in, while taking paying clients to sustain the practice. Within 6 months, he had more work than he could handle. The victory against Westridge had become a template, and communities across the region were organizing using the same strategies. Thomas would later say that the case had fundamentally changed his understanding of what it meant to practice law. He'd been trained to see law as a technical exercise, finding loopholes, exploiting ambiguities, winning through procedural advantage. Working with Susan had taught him something different. He'd learned that law could be an instrument of justice when it was wielded by people committed to truth rather than victory. He became deeply involved in the community. He started dating one of the local teachers. He began attending town meetings. He integrated himself into the fabric of the valley in ways that suggested his decision to leave corporate law wasn't strategic, maneuvering, but genuine transformation. Rachel Martinez's situation transformed as well, though not without complications. After her legal settlement with Westridge, she struggled. She'd been blacklisted by corporate development firms for her whistleblowing. She couldn't get hired in land acquisition. For a moment, it seemed like standing up for ethics had cost her everything. But the community rallied. Local ranchers hired her as a consultant. They needed someone who understood corporate tactics intimately. Rachel could help property owners understand what they were facing. She could warn them about manipulation strategies before they occurred. Within 6 months, Rachel had built a consulting business focused on helping rural landowners negotiate with corporations. She had clients across 3 states. She was using her insider knowledge to protect communities rather than exploit them. She would later describe it as redemption, not from malice she'd committed, but from complicity she'd allowed. She became friends with her and him, not despite the attempted entrapment, but because of it. They understood each other's journey from being used by corporate systems to breaking free from those systems. They understood what it meant to choose integrity over self-preservation. Susan's law practice exploded. She was invited to speak at law schools about litigation strategy and corporate accountability. She published articles about predatory corporate practices in environmental law journals. She became a recognized expert on the subject, not through traditional career advancement, but through actual victories in the courtroom. More importantly, Susan found something she hadn't expected: friendship. She and her had developed a deep connection through months of working together. They began meeting for coffee regularly. Susan talked about her own journey, how she'd spent decades focused entirely on career, convinced that personal relationships would distract from professional achievement. Working on this case had shown her something different. She'd learned that connection actually improved her work. Caring about the clients and community made her a better attorney. Susan started dating the mayor. It wasn't dramatic or announced. It just happened gradually as they spent more time together at community events. By the time anyone noticed, it was clear they'd been building something real for months. David's documentary changed his career trajectory entirely. Major film distributors wanted to pick it up. Streaming services offered substantial money for rights. David negotiated carefully, ensuring the film remained accessible to communities who needed it. He sold distribution rights, but insisted on creative control and the right to share the film freely with non-profit organizations and community groups. The documentary won 3 major film festival awards. It was featured at the Los Angeles Film Festival, the Tribeca Film Festival, and received a nomination for several documentary awards. More significantly, it became a tool for community organizing. Environmental groups showed it at town halls. Community development organizations used it in training programs. It reached over 2 million viewers online. But David's most important work happened locally. He remained in the valley, documenting the changes that followed the trial. He filmed the ranch operation as it transformed from isolated properties into a cooperative model. He documented the community center that was being built, a gathering space designed by her and him to facilitate the kind of connection and coordination that had made their victory possible. David spoke about how the case had restored his faith in documentary filmmaking as a tool for social change. He'd spent years making films that exposed problems. This case taught him that filmmaking could also celebrate solutions and document transformation. The ranch itself became something entirely unexpected. After the trial, several community members approached him and her with an idea. What if the property became a model for sustainable agriculture and community development? What if they created a demonstration project that proved rural properties could be economically viable without selling to corporations or abandoning environmental integrity? He and she initially were uncertain. They'd bought their land to create a sanctuary, not become a public project. But over time, they saw the potential. They could use the ranch as an educational center. They could teach other communities what they'd learned. They could create jobs and economic opportunities without compromising the land or community. With Susan's legal guidance and Thomas's help navigating business structuring, they established the property as a non-profit research and education center. They named it the West Ridge Land Trust, not to honor the corporation, but to transform its meaning. The name that represented predatory practice became the name of protective practice. The trust hired local staff, farm managers, educational coordinators, administrative support. They brought in university researchers to document their sustainable water practices and agricultural methods. They hosted workshops teaching community organizing strategies. Within a year, the property had become a regional destination. People came from across the country to learn about sustainable ranching and community-based land protection. Universities sent students for internships. Documentary filmmakers came to film the ongoing project. But more importantly for her and him, the property remained home. Their personal residence occupied the original house. The trust operations expanded into additional structures built specifically for the education center. They maintained clear boundaries between their private life and their public mission. The relationship between her and him deepened in unexpected ways. Living in the public eye challenged them. Their romance became known. Media covered it, community members referenced it. Researchers studied it as part of the larger story of community organizing, but they handled it by maintaining fierce boundaries around their private intimacy while being transparent about their commitment. They gave interviews about their story, but never disclosed details of their personal life. They allowed their love to be visible. They touched each other openly, spoke about each other with obvious affection, made joint decisions about their shared future. 6 months after the trial, he proposed. Not dramatically, not publicly. He simply placed his mother's engagement ring, the ring she'd left in the house, on her finger one morning while they were having coffee on the porch. He said he'd finally opened his mother's journal completely and found something unexpected. Her mother had included a letter in the journal's final pages. The letter described the ring. It described how she'd worn it despite unhappiness in her marriage. She'd written, "I'm leaving this ring for someone brave enough to understand that commitment to another person isn't commitment to suffering. It's commitment to genuine love." He said his mother had wanted him to give the ring to someone who understood that distinction, someone who was brave enough to commit not from obligation but from choice. She said yes, immediately. She said yes to the ring, to the commitment, to the future they were building together. The wedding took place on the property 3 months later. Over 300 people attended, community members, colleagues, family, even some of the journalists who'd covered the case. David filmed it as part of his ongoing documentation. Susan served as an officiant. She'd gotten ordained specifically to perform the ceremony. Thomas managed logistics. Rachel helped coordinate the celebration. It was a love story, but it was also explicitly a community event. Every element reflected the connections they'd built. Local ranchers catered the reception using produce from the property. Local musicians performed. The ceremony was held in the outdoor pavilion, designed to host community gatherings. In their vows, she spoke about discovering that strength wasn't isolation, but connection. She spoke about how she'd built a fortress thinking it was freedom, only to discover that real freedom was being willing to be vulnerable with someone she trusted. Completely, he spoke about discovering that safety wasn't about control, but about the courage to engage authentically with the world and other people. He spoke about his mother teaching him that connection was dangerous and learning that the opposite was true. Disconnection was what actually endangered you. They spoke about gratitude for the community that supported them, for the people who chose to stand with them against corporate predation, for the reality that no one survives alone. The wedding night, they stayed at their home on the property that had been abandoned by his mother, purchased by her after years of isolation, that had become the center of a movement protecting rural communities. Lying in bed, he asked if she ever thought about what would have happened if she'd refused Westridge's initial offer differently. If she'd negotiated, if she'd accepted a smaller settlement, if she'd tried to maintain some kind of relationship with the corporation. She said she didn't wonder because those weren't real alternatives. She said you either stood for something or you didn't. You either believed that places and communities mattered or you treated them as commodities. There was no middle ground. He said he'd learned that from her. He said his mother had taught him that compromise was always possible, that you could negotiate with anything if you wanted to badly enough. He said she had taught him that some things weren't negotiable. Some principles had to be defended completely. They talked about what came next. The trust was growing. The educational programs were expanding. They'd been approached about starting similar projects in other valleys facing corporate pressure. They'd been invited to speak at universities and conferences. Their story was becoming a template for community organizing, but underneath the expanding mission, they remained focused on what had mattered most. The property itself, the people living in the valley, the relationships they'd built and continued building. She said something that captured the essence of their transformation. 6 months ago, I hadn't felt another person's touch in 6 months. I thought that meant I was strong. I thought it meant I didn't need anyone. I didn't understand that touch, real human connection, was the strongest thing I could feel. Not a luxury or an indulgence. Not something weak people needed, but something essential to actually being human. He held her close. He thought about his mother's warning about people and danger. He thought about how completely that warning had shaped his life. He thought about how her willingness to be vulnerable had destroyed that warning's power over him. They fell asleep together in their home on the land they'd chosen to defend. Outside, the desert night was vast and peaceful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The trust to develop, educational programs to coordinate, other communities seeking advice. But tonight, they rested in the knowledge that they'd discovered something their society taught them to fear, that vulnerability was actually a form of strength. That connection was actually survival. That love, real love, made you more capable of facing the world, not less. 1 year after the trial verdict, the Westridge Land Trust hosted its first annual symposium on community-based land protection. Over 500 people attended: ranchers, environmental activists, community organizers, educators, filmmakers, and lawyers. They came from 17 states. They came because they'd seen the documentary, or read about the case, or heard from someone who'd been changed by the story. The symposium wasn't about celebrating victory. It was about understanding what had been learned and sharing that knowledge with communities facing similar battles. Speakers included environmental scientists, legal experts, and community members from places where Westridge had operated previously. But the most powerful sessions were the testimonies. Ranchers from 3 different states described their own experiences with corporate land acquisition and how they'd used the strategies developed in this valley to resist. They spoke about community organizing. They spoke about finding legal representation willing to fight ethically. They spoke about refusing isolation. A woman from New Mexico stood up and said something that captured the symposium's deeper purpose. We were all being told the same story. That our land wasn't valuable unless a corporation wanted it. That our survival depended on selling. That standing together was impossible because we were too spread out, too isolated, too insignificant. This valley proved that story was a lie. They proved that communities are stronger than corporations. That connection beats isolation. That saying no and meaning it actually works. She and him listened from the back of the symposium hall. They weren't presenting. They deliberately stepped back from being the central figures in the narrative. They wanted others to own the story, to adapt it to their own situations, to build their own movements. But they were present. They moved through the symposium as facilitators and hosts, helping people connect with each other, answering questions, offering whatever wisdom they'd accumulated through their experience. Late one afternoon, a young couple approached them. The man was maybe 25, the woman perhaps 24. They introduced themselves as farmers from Iowa who were facing corporate pressure to sell their multi-generational farm. They said they'd watched the documentary 3 times. They said it had given them courage to resist. The couple asked if they could visit the property. They wanted to see the water system. They wanted to understand the model. They wanted to learn how community organizing could work in their context. She and him spent the next day walking the couple through the property. They explained the engineering. They explained the community coordination. They explained the legal strategy. But most importantly, they explained something intangible. They explained what it felt like to refuse isolation, what it felt like to ask for help, what it felt like to know that you weren't alone in the fight. As the young couple was leaving, the woman pulled her aside. She said something that made her cry. Good tears, meaningful tears. The young woman said, I grew up thinking strength meant never asking for help. I thought vulnerability was weakness. Watching your story, seeing how you and him built something together instead of trying to manage everything separately, it changed how I understand myself. I'm going to talk to my partner differently about this farm. I'm going to let him matter. We're going to let community matter. Thank you for showing us that was possible. That evening, she and him sat on the porch of their home, a ritual they maintained no matter how busy life became. She told him what the young farmer had said. He asked her what she was thinking about. She said she was thinking about how their story had traveled, how it had touched people they'd never meet, how sharing their vulnerability had somehow given other people permission to be vulnerable in their own lives. She said something she'd been processing for months. I spent 15 years believing that vulnerability was a liability. I thought if I let anyone see how scared I was, how lonely I was, they would exploit that. I thought strength meant being completely self-contained. But I was wrong. Vulnerability was actually my greatest strength. It's what allowed me to build real relationships. It's what allowed me to ask for help. It's what made me capable of resisting Westridge, because I wasn't trying to do it alone. He said he understood that now, in ways he never could have before meeting her. He said his mother had taught him that vulnerability was dangerous, that people would use your weakness against you. He said living that belief had created exactly the isolation she'd predicted would harm him. He said, "I think my mother was trying to protect me, but she was protecting me from the wrong thing. She was trying to protect me from hurt. But the hurt of isolation was worse than any hurt I could experience from connection." She didn't understand that. She asked if he'd forgiven his mother. He said yes, but not in the way forgiveness usually worked. He said he'd forgiven her by refusing to repeat her patterns. He said every time he chose vulnerability with her, every time he chose community over isolation, every time he chose trust over self-protection, he was forgiving his mother. He was breaking the cycle. The symposium continued for 3 days. On the final evening, David screened an extended cut of his documentary, a feature-length version that he'd been developing for release in theaters. The extended version included footage from the aftermath of the trial. It showed the property transformation. It showed the wedding. It showed the Westridge Land Trust being built and launched. But most powerfully, it showed community. It showed people from different backgrounds, different experiences, different ideologies coming together around shared principle. It showed what was possible when people chose connection over isolation. When the screening ended, the audience stood and applauded for nearly 10 minutes. David stood and acknowledged the applause, but he pointed toward her and him sitting in the audience. The applause shifted. The room focused on them. They stood uncomfortable with being centered. But they understood that accepting the recognition was part of their work now. It was part of demonstrating that ordinary people could take extraordinary action, that vulnerability could be powerful, that love could be the foundation of resistance. After the screening, journalists wanted interviews. Community organizers wanted advice. Film distributors wanted to discuss theatrical release. But she and him excused themselves. They needed to be alone. They drove out to the highest point of their property. They stood looking out at the valley, the same vista they'd stood before, to make decisions about fighting Westridge, about getting married, about building the trust. The landscape hadn't changed, but their relationship to it had transformed completely. What had felt like burden had become purpose. What had felt like vulnerability had become strength. She took his hand. She said she wanted to tell him something she'd been thinking about. She said that when the documentary premiered at Sundance, one reviewer had written that the story was about a strong woman and an innocent man learning to love. She said she'd been bothered by that framing for months. She said it suggested that she was the strong one and he was weak, that she was the teacher and he was the student. She said she wanted to reframe that. She said they were both strong. They were strong in different ways, but both essential. She said her strength came from her willingness to stand alone, to protect what mattered to her. His strength came from his capacity for deep connection, his ability to build relationships that could withstand pressure. She said together, their strengths had created something neither could have created alone. She said her isolation would have made her vulnerable to Westridge if she'd been truly alone. His desire for connection would have made him vulnerable to corporate manipulation if he hadn't learned discernment. But together, They'd created something resilient. She said, "We're not a story about a strong woman saving a weak man. We're a story about two incomplete people becoming complete through connection. We're a story about how vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the prerequisite for real strength." He pulled her close. He said he loved her. He said it the way he said it every day now, without hesitation or fear, without wondering if she'd reject him or if connection would be revealed as a trap. She said she loved him too. She said she loved him for his capacity to grow. She said she loved him for his willingness to break the patterns his mother had taught him. She said she loved him for choosing vulnerability. They stood together as the sun descended toward the horizon. The sky shifted through colors, blue to orange to pink to purple. The same sunset that had greeted him when he arrived at the property nearly 2 years ago. The same desert landscape that had witnessed their entire transformation. Looking back over the past 2 years, they could identify the moments when everything had shifted. The moment she brought him coffee that first morning. The moment he decided to refuse Westridge's offer. The moment she told him she loved him. The moment they stood before the community and asked for help. But they also recognized something important. There was no single moment of transformation. It had been a process. It had been hundreds of small choices to trust, to be vulnerable, to let someone matter. She asked him if he ever thought about what his life would be like if they hadn't met. If she'd refused to help with the water system, if he'd accepted Westridge's offer. He said he did think about that sometimes. He said he would probably still be alive. He'd probably have sold the property. He'd probably have moved to another city or another job, continuing the pattern of isolation his mother had established. He said, "I would have survived, but I wouldn't have lived. There's a difference. Surviving is just managing not to die. Living is actually mattering to people and having people matter to you. Living is connection." She nodded. She said she'd lived in survival mode for 15 years. She'd built a fortress and called it strength, but it had actually been imprisonment. She said meeting him had liberated her. As darkness fell, they remained on the hillside. Stars emerged, the same stars his mother had taught him to navigate by. The same stars she'd learned to navigate by alone in the desert. But now they were navigating together, and the stars meant something different. They weren't navigation points for escape. They were reminders of connection to the earth, to each other, to the vast network of humans who were learning that vulnerability and connection were actually the path forward. The documentary would continue to reach people. The Westridge Land Trust would continue to help communities. The model of community-based resistance would continue to spread. But for her and him, the real victory was something quieter. It was the ability to touch and be touched without fear. It was the capacity to ask for help and accept it. It was the willingness to let someone see them fully, their fears, their failures, their desperate need for connection, and trust that they would be loved anyway. It was understanding that the greatest risk wasn't in vulnerability. The greatest risk was in believing you could survive entirely alone. Years later, people would interview them about the case, about the victory, about the impact. They would ask what advice they had for other communities facing similar corporate pressure. She would talk about organization and legal strategy. She would talk about the importance of professional support and coordinated action. She would give tactical advice about community organizing. He would talk about the deeper truth, the importance of connection, of being willing to be vulnerable, of understanding that real strength came from interdependence rather than independence. But both of them would eventually say the same thing. They hadn't set out to create a movement or to become a story that inspired others. They'd set out to protect their home and their community. They'd set out to stand together rather than surrender separately. Everything that followed, the legal victory, the documentary, the trust, the speaking engagements, had emerged from that simple choice to refuse isolation. And if they had any wisdom to share, it was this. the path forward for individuals. 4. Communities for societies wasn't through stronger walls or more isolated safety. It was through the terrifying, vulnerable, absolutely essential work of connection. It was through allowing people to matter to you, through asking for help, through being willing to stand beside someone else, even when it made you vulnerable, even when it required courage you didn't know you had. The night air was cool, the stars were brilliant, and two people who had arrived at connection through very different journeys, one from fear of isolation, one from isolation itself, held each other and knew they'd found something more valuable than safety. They'd found a home, not just in the land, but in each other, and they'd discovered that real homes weren't built by walls that kept others out. They were built by connections that let others in. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.